Welcome to the CRS Elevation Certificate Training Series on how to fill out an elevation certificate correctly, specifically how to do it for CRS purposes. This is the third video in this series and will cover sections C and D of the form. For information on where to find a copy of the current elevation certificate form, what it's used for, and why it's important in CRS communities, please refer to the first video in our series, How to Fill Out an Elevation Certificate Correctly, Section A. We are going to take sections C and D together in this video, since they are the sections in which the licensed professional, which is the engineer, the surveyor, or architect, is mostly responsible for. While the local floodplain administrator is also allowed to fill out section C, this is a very rare occurrence. According to the EC instructions, the community official who is authorized by law or ordinance to administer the community's floodplain management ordinance may complete section C using elevation data from other documentation that has been signed and sealed by a licensed surveyor, engineer, or architect who is authorized by law to certify elevation information. We talk more about this in the video covering section G of the form. Sections C and D comprise page 2 of the EC. Section C contains the elevation data for the different floors of the building, the machinery and equipment servicing the building, and the grades adjacent to the building. It needs to be filled out for every EC except for when the building is located in an AO zone or a zone A without a BFE determined. When either of these is the case, sections E and F should be filled out instead. Section D contains the licensed professional's name, license number, signature, date, and seal. It also contains the very important comment section, which should probably have something written there for every EC. Starting with section C, let's begin with the first field, C1. This field asks the certifier to identify which stage of construction the building is in. This is a required field since both insurance and compliance rely on whether the building is finished or still under construction. For permitting purposes, a community may require ECs at any point along the construction process, as it's important to keep an eye on the building as it progresses. For CRS purposes, you will only be asked to submit those ECs that are marked Finished Construction. We'll want to see the as-built elevations and information for a finished building, but not anything prior to that. An EC with 2 or more of these options marked, or without any of the options marked, is an error. It is also an error if an EC is provided to CRS that is marked Construction Drawings or Building Under Construction. Because you are supposed to be submitting the finished construction ECs, this is considered an error. However, there are 2 cases in which C1 can be left blank: when the building is in an unnumbered A zone and when it's in an AO zone. In these cases, the person certifying the elevations just fills out section E and signs, dates, and provides comments in section F. With the 2023 EC, there are now boxes to identify the stage of the construction the building is in section E. Please mark the appropriate box there. There are 4 parts of C2 that can be filled out before getting to all the elevations starting in C2A and going through C2H. The benchmark utilized, the vertical datum of that benchmark, and the datum used in the elevations in C2A through C2H. With the new 2023 EC comes the question of whether a conversion factor was used for the datum. For this section of the form, the most important part we check for CRS purposes is the datum of the elevations and whether a conversion factor was needed or used. These 2 items need to be filled out and filled out correctly. Be sure the datum marked here in C2 matches the datum in field B11. If they do not match, there must be an explanation in the comment section of how the surveyor converted the elevations in C2 to match the datum of the BFE given in B9. If the datum in C2 is blank or different than the datum in B11 and there is no conversion explanation, then this is an error. If the datums are the same in B11 and C2, then there is no need to mark either the yes or no box for whether a conversion factor was used. Otherwise, one of the boxes needs to be checked. Next, we'll move on to the elevations themselves in C2. Before we go through each one, I want to point out that the local official is not required to make sure that the elevations are correct here. The licensed professional certifies that with their signature and seal on the form. However, it is the local official's duty to make sure that the elevations filled out seem about right and make sense with the building diagram that's used in field A7. This is one of the trickiest things to do with ECs. Another note before we cover the elevations in depth. Elevations for all relevant floors, machinery and equipment, and adjacent grades should always be given. If they are irrelevant to the building, an NA should be placed in the field. For example, if the EC is for a one-story slab-on-grade building with an attached garage in an AE zone, the building would have an elevation for C2A, the top of the bottom floor. Since it's a one-story slab-on-grade building, it would not have an elevation for C2B, top of the next higher floor. The EC instructions say to enter NA for this, so we expect to see an NA for C2B. We would also expect to see an NA for C2C, the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member, since this building is in an AE zone, not a coastal V zone. The elevation for C2C can be placed here for a building in an AE zone if it's part of a community's coastal A zone. And since this building has an attached garage, we would expect to see elevations for C2D, the attached garage. This example explained why and when the use of NA is required and when it is not. We strongly encourage the use of NA in all irrelevant fields for a building. The problem is sometimes that it's not clear if the field should have had an elevation or not. That's why NA should always be used for irrelevant or not applicable fields for a building. However, if the field is left blank and we can tell that it is irrelevant to the building, it will not be counted as an error for CRS purposes. We'll revisit this issue for each field as we go through them. And the last thing to note for the elevations is that feet or meters should always be marked. As of now, meters is only used for Puerto Rico since their firms show elevations in meters. Everyone else should have feet marked. Like the BFEs in Section B, elevations in Section C should be to the nearest tenth of a foot or nearest tenth of a meter in Puerto Rico. It will not be counted as an error if they are to the nearest hundredth or thousandth, but that level of accuracy is not necessary. Now let's start with the first elevation in C2. C2A is always required. Every building has a lowest floor, so be sure something is always there. C2B is usually required, but it depends on the building and whether there is a next highest floor. For all building diagrams, there could be an entry for C2B, depending on whether there are 2 more stories to the building, if it's an elevated building with an enclosure underneath, or if the building has a crawl space for its foundation. For CRS purposes, if this is left blank for building diagrams that require it, or if pictures with the EC clearly show a next higher floor, it's an error. Encourage surveyors to place an NA in this field if it's not applicable to the building. Try not to leave it blank. We might overlook a blank, but only if the building obviously does not have a next higher floor. C2C is an elevation for the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member. This elevation is typically for diagrams 5 and 6 buildings that are in V zones and in all regulated areas subject to coastal flooding like coastal A zones. So for buildings in A zones, an NA should be entered. For buildings like V zones or coastal A zones, there should be an elevation placed in this field. Communities that regulate coastal A zones require V zone standards in either a portion or all of your A zone. For such communities, the elevation for C2C must be entered on the EC for buildings in your coastal A zone. If this elevation is shown on the EC in areas outside of a V or a coastal A zone, it is not an error. C2D attached garage. Remember in our discussion for Section A, we talked about when something is an attached garage and when it isn't. If the building has an attached garage, then the elevation gets entered in this field. Remember, this is for non-elevated buildings. Diagrams 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 3, 4, and 9. If the EC is for an elevated building, then there technically is no attached garage, and NA should be entered here. This is for a diagram 5, 6, 7, or 8. If the square footage or the number of openings or anything else is entered in A9 for an elevated building, it will be considered an error unless the surveyor's comments in section D clearly explain all floor elevations and their uses. Next is C2E. This field causes many errors. This field asks for the lowest elevation of the machinery or equipment that is servicing the building. Then, the surveyor is to describe the type of equipment and location of it in the Section D comments box. Machinery and equipment include furnaces, AC units, hot water heaters, ductwork, sump pumps, heat pumps, generators, and elevators. It does not include water or sewer pipes, electrical lines, water meters, gas meters, electricity meters, public utility transformers or power generators, or other pieces of equipment that are not owned by the insured. Let's talk more about C2E. According to the EC instructions, a finished construction EC is supposed to be completed only once all machinery or equipment have been installed and the grading around the building is complete. So that means if there is going to be machinery servicing the building, it must be installed and it must be identified on the finished construction EC. The best way to avoid many errors here is not to accept a finished construction EC until all machinery are installed. You may have a building that has machinery or equipment installed on the roof. This is usually a commercial building or possibly a housing complex. In this situation, some surveyors think that this is obviously high enough or have difficulty shooting an elevation for it, so they leave the field blank. No matter how high the lowest elevation of equipment is, an elevation for it must be given. Insurance and compliance are affected by where the equipment servicing the building is. It must be shown on the form. You may have cases where there's no machinery or equipment servicing the building. Situations like agricultural buildings or storage units where no heating, cooling, or hot water is required. In these cases, NA is the proper entry for this field. Pictures are not an adequate method of showing the elevation. The actual elevation of the lowest piece of machinery or equipment itself must be on the EC. Then, surveyors have to describe the type and location of the equipment in the comment section box in Section D. Failure to have any comments in Section D is not an error, but it helps to have those comments whenever a reviewer has questions. Next, we get into the adjacent grades next to the building. This will help determine how high the lowest floor of the next higher floor is above grade for both insurance and compliance purposes. Both C2F, the lowest adjacent grade, or lag, and C2G, the highest adjacent grade, or HAG, must be entered for every building. There is always a lowest and highest adjacent grade next to the foundation of the building, so these two fields are always required. You will notice with the 2023 EC that there are boxes now to identify whether the lag and HAG or the natural grade or finished grade. Natural grade means the grade prior to the start of construction. One of these boxes must be marked, otherwise it will be an error. And lastly, C2H. Starting with the 2023 EC, we are now requiring an elevation to be entered here if it's relevant to the building. This field is very important for compliance purposes. If a house is built outside of the SFHA, but the attached deck or stairs to the house reaches a point inside the SFHA, then the entire house is considered to be in the SFHA and all NFIP regulations then apply to it. That completes all portions of Section C. Now let's discuss the most common errors we see in Section C. Not getting the finished construction EC or C1 not being marked at all. All the information may be correct on the EC, but if it's not marked for finished construction, then it cannot be accepted for CRS or insurance purposes, so it's considered wrong. The next error we continually see is the datums for B11, which is the datum for the BFE on the map, and C2, the datum for the elevation by the surveyor not matching, or when the datums are different but no conversion between the two datums is given. It is extremely important to be able to determine if building elevations are elevated high enough with respect to the BFE. Remember, there is a new question in C2 for whether a conversion was done when the elevations are different. It must be answered, and if yes, the conversion must be described in the comments area of section D. Another common error we see, and probably the most common of all three of these, is the missing elevation for machinery and equipment in C2E. We already talked at length earlier about the importance of making sure there is an elevation in this field. Local officials should do their best to make sure an elevation is there. Additionally, a description of the type of machinery and where it's located should be given in the section D comments box. Even in the rare case where there is no machinery servicing the building, that should be explained. Now that we've talked about section C and common errors, let's turn our attention to section D. This is the main section where the licensed professional completing the form signs, dates, and provides their seal to certify the information on the form. The licensed professional must be a land surveyor, engineer, or architect who is authorized by law in your state to certify elevation information. Their signature and seal represents that this is their best efforts to interpret the available data and that any false statement is punishable by law. There are 5 things we are looking for. First, the seal must be provided. When submitting your ECs for CRS review, know that it doesn't have to be the original seal. It can be a copy of the original form. However, be sure the seal is visible when making copies. We need to be able to see the certifier's name and license number, along with the signature and date. The certifier's name and license number are important as this is what the local official or FEMA needs to know in case the surveyor needs to be contacted. The signature and date are required as a way to officially certify the document. The date is also very critical to which EC form is being used. Each form has an expiration date, so we check this date against the expiration date of the form to make sure the correct version of the form was used. A key part of section D is the comment section at the end. If you read carefully through the new EC instructions, you will notice at least 10 distinct instances where comments are required if they apply to the building. Let's cover the instances that require comments. If the datum for elevations shot in section C2 are not in the same datum the firm is in, then a conversion factor must be explained. If machinery and/or equipment servicing the building is present, the machinery must be described and a location given for it. If the attachments box in section D is checked, a description of the attachments must be included. If openings are present for an enclosure or attached garage, and the interior grade instead of the exterior grade was used to determine if they are within 1 foot of grade, this must be explained. If engineered openings are used in the building, the manufacturer's name and model number must be provided. Also, the engineered opening certificate or ICCES report must be attached to the EC as well. If a LOMA or LOMER F or LOMER has been issued for the property, you must provide the letter date and case number. Additionally, if the map in effect at the time of permitting is different than the current firm at the time of certification, describe this and provide all the required information from the previous firm, B4, B5, B7, B8, and B9. Continuing on with explanations that are needed in the section D comments area. If the map information used is based on best available data, like base level engineering or advisory flood hazard data, provide this information. If the surveyor cannot access the crawl space floor to shoot the floor elevation, they must provide what procedure they used to determine the floor's elevation. And lastly, if additional surveyed floor elevations are needed for multiple floors or multi-level enclosures, clarify which floors are entered as C2A and C2B. Read through these comments when you receive an EC to make sure everything here makes sense for the building. You'll hear us mention many times throughout these videos how a surveyor can use this section to help explain or show key information. Now that we've covered the many uses of section D, let's discuss common errors. The first is the seal missing. Make sure you get an EC with a seal on it. If the seal is missing on your copy for CRS purposes, make sure the surveyor's name, license number, signature, and date are in section D. The second is no signature and/or date. Please be sure your surveyors sign and date the form. These components are very important. Sometimes comments that should be given that help explain the situation are missing, or the ones provided don't match up with all the other information on the form. Be sure the comments are nice and clear and add to the form instead of confusing it. As a reminder, we will cover how to correct errors once you identify them in a separate training video called How to Correct an Elevation Certificate. Be sure to watch that video as well for the various ways you can fix any error you see on the EC. That concludes training on how to fill out sections C and D of the elevation certificate correctly. Please go to our next training video in the series, How to Fill Out an Elevation Certificate Correctly, sections E and F. Thank you.